And thank you for coming to our update on the health of three watersheds, the Rapid River, Lower Rainy River, and Rainy River-Rainy Lake. This is being hosted by Coochin SWCD, myself, Jolene Simon, and Mike Hurst out of Lake of the Woods SWCD. Mike, are you out there?
Yes, hi. Welcome, everybody.
All right. So this is a partnership with MPCA, a project that is funded through MPCA, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and in partnership with Emmons and Olivier, or EOR contracting. So today we'll be hearing about the sampling and results of the sampling of what's been happening in these three watersheds with presentations by Pat Conrad of Emmons and Olivier, Mike Kennedy, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and Nate Milky of Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So just a few reminders for housekeeping. We've muted everyone for right now. If you are having any technical issues, please type in the box for help. We do have everyone muted at the moment, but we do welcome you to type questions in the chat box. We have someone watching for that. And if you have any technical issues, we will try to help you. So we will be watching for that as well. This session is being recorded up until question and answers. So once question and answers do start, we will turn off that recording at the end. So feel free to unmute yourself at that time and we'll let you know and ask your questions, or you can just type them in the chat box. So the questions that may not have time to be answered today will be brought back to our session next week on October 27th at noon. So we'll ask you to keep muted, to keep your camera off just to save bandwidth, and hold those questions for the end. So we'll be watching for those, and it should be good. So if you have any questions, type them in. And without further ado, I'd like to go straight into our first presentation, which is Mike Kennedy of MPCA.
Thank you very much, Jolene, and welcome and thank you for having us and taking time out of your day to attend today's meeting, to those of you that are there. Jolene, I'll just say okay, and you'll forward the slide for me?
Yes, that's perfect. All
righty, you can hit the button. Today, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about an overview, a big picture of our watershed approach here in the state of Minnesota. It has a lot of moving parts with several different organizations, both state agencies as well as local partners such as soil and water districts and county environmental services departments, watershed districts. I'd like to start off, if you could imagine a clock at my round graphic here, and somewhere around the 10 or 11 o'clock time frame, you could see monitoring and assessment. And this usually kicks off our watershed work on a major watershed scale, usually somewhere 1,200, 1,500 square mile watersheds, where monitoring and assessment begins looking at the chemistry, the fish biology, and the macroinvertebrates, or the aquatic insects, or sometimes we even shorten it and say the bugs in the water. How are those three conditions in our local rivers and in our local lakes? Once we do 2 years of monitoring and assessment, we move into a year of stressor identification, which helps us identify what are the root causes of some of the poorer conditions that we're seeing out on our landscape. And some of those situations might call for us to deem a water to be impaired. At that point, in impaired water, we would need to do a TMDL, a total maximum daily load. I like to think of it as a large research project over why that water body isn't meeting a standard and what can be done to bring it back into a level of approval of where it's not as polluted as it had been found. Also in this area, in the restoration and protection strategy areas, where we update our RAPS, our Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy Report. And usually about this time frame, we're in the 4 to 5 year mark of our work in a watershed. And then we pass along our findings, our TMDL, and our high-level strategies from the RAPS document to local partners such as sports clubs, county governments, soil and water districts, and watershed districts that can then work on best management practices and projects to restore our beat up waters and to hopefully protect some of our high quality waters. This process starts all over again every 10 years. Go ahead, Jolene. As I said, it's a 10-year approach of monitoring and planning and implementing on a what we call a Huck 8 scale. That's fancy technical term for a scale of a watershed. And as I indicated before, those watersheds are somewhere around 1,000 to 1,500 square miles. The watershed approach allows us to integrate state agency and citizen and local monitoring and provide a big water quality picture. Often state agency personnel cannot know local waters as intimately as local partners or local citizens. So state agencies take full advantage of citizen monitoring efforts by volunteers, as well as monitoring by our local partners to get a nice big overall snapshot of water quality in a particular watershed. The watershed approach allows us to identify impairments and waters in need of additional protection. Often, if we can get ahead of the curve and prevent a water body from slipping into an impaired status by looking at trends over time, we would like to do that and try to get ahead of the curve and make sure that water body doesn't become impaired. Lastly, the watershed approach allows us to coordinate our TMDL and protection efforts within the watershed. So all 5 state agencies, the Pollution Control Agency, the DNR, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health, and the Board of Soil and Water Resources all come together in one place within one watershed with our local partners to do that coordination and protection. Okay, Jolene. The watershed approach has a lot of benefits compared to the old way that we used to look at water in our state. Again, we're looking at the whole watershed and managing it as one large system, irrelevant of political boundaries such as county borders or municipal borders. It allows us to look at the physical, the chemical, and the biological components of a watershed, all 3 vitally important to it functioning properly. We have a lot of different tools and procedures to define problems and solutions. And oftentimes, thanks to our Clean Water Legacy funds, we have the fiscal resources to reach out into the greater public to find solutions that we can't come up with on our own. It has accountability built into it, lots of data and measurements to track the progress or lack thereof in our water quality across the state. It's locally driven oftentimes. Our partners are intimately involved in all of the watershed work in the Rainy Basin. The data and the information tell the story of where we've been and where we are in terms of our water quality. And most Minnesotans, we've made a high commitment to having clean water, and we have high expectations. After all, our population raised our own taxes in 2008 during a recession in order to provide funding for clean water across our state. Okay, Jolene. This is a map just to give you an idea of what the state of Minnesota looks like from a watershed perspective. No counties on here, just large watersheds. And I apologize, some of the colors in the darker greens are very hard to read. Let's zoom in on the northeast part of the state where we're talking about today. And Jolene, you can advance the slide. I think the next one has our watersheds we're going to talk about today circled. The easy one to look at is the right side, Rainy River-Rainy Lake, kind of a reverse boomerang, if you will, above the Little Fork, which is in red. And then we have the lower Rainy watershed, which looks like 2 saddlebags, east and a west side, and they come in either side of where the Rapid River enters into the Rainy River. So moving from Lake of the Woods towards International Falls, we have the lower Rainy West Saddle, the Rapid River watershed, the lower Rainy East Saddle, and lastly, Rainy River-Rainy Lake. And these are the three specific areas that we'll be talking about today. And all three of these watersheds are in their cycle 1 process for the RAPS project and program. Cycle 1 simply means that this is the opportunity to develop a baseline understanding of our stream biology, bugs and fish, our stream and lake chemistry, as well as some of the geological aspects and social aspects of these watersheds. Okay, Jolene. The Board of Soil and Water works along with the MPCA with local governments to provide updates in the TMDLs, as I referenced earlier. MPCA works with local governments who usually drive future needs in terms of protection and restoration, what types of data they need in order to do a project, what types of understanding that the local partners need, to work on a field scale to protect high quality waters and restore impaired waters. Next. The Board of Soil and Water Resources, a different state agency, funds local projects that target priority areas that have measurable results. Local governments can apply for public participation funds and project funds through annual Board of Soil and Water Resource grant programs. The Board of Soil and Water Resources also has a program called One Watershed, One Plan, and this is where the future for Minnesota water quality funding is in Minnesota. Each watershed will have a plan working with neighboring counties and municipalities to protect and restore the waters within that large watershed. Okay. So at this point, I know that was fast to talk about a 10-year process, but I didn't want to overwhelm participants with a lot of extraneous information. Suffice to say, the state and the county with our partners work very hard for about 5 years to gain an understanding and assess the waters. And then the state and the county and local partners work to implement projects on the ground the next 5 years. And then the process starts all over again to complete a 10-year cycle. Just a quick note of interest, you'll see on the right side of this slide, a couple of folks standing in a river looking at a tube. This is part of our Little Fork River sediment fingerprinting project. And of course, the nice picture to the left is a nice picture of Rainy Lake, one of the watersheds we'll be looking at today. At this point, I'd like to open it up to any questions that folks might have about the 10-year process, the big picture of how state agencies work with local partners in our watershed work. Well, if there's no questions, I'll turn it over back to Jolene Simon and we'll continue on with the rest of the meeting. By all means, if you think of a question later, type it in the chat box and we'll be sure to answer it as best we can.
Thanks, Mike. That was exactly what I was going to say. Perfect. So yes, at any time, type something in the chat box for us and we will be sure to hold on to that until the end or bring it up in the next session if we don't have time today. So with that, thank you very much, Mike. And I'd like to hand it over to Nate Milkey. And he is also from MPCA. Oh, this is off. I'm sorry. Hopefully this doesn't. Nate, if this is a problem, I can go out and try and fix it. But hopefully it's just the cover slide. So Nate, when you're ready, I'm going to let you take it away.
Hopefully fine. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you great.
All right, so I'm the biological lead for the Rainy Lake Watershed, and I'm the fish lead for the Lower Rainy and Rapid River Watershed. Essentially, all that means is I authored and I was through all the steps of site selection for Rainy Lake, and I helped assess the water bodies within the Rapid and Lower Rainy. The next slide. So our 10-year process, the intensive watershed monitoring, the Rainy Lake and the Rapid and Lower Rainy were one of the last watersheds to be assessed in the state. That began in 2017 and continued through 2018. From there, we moved to our assessments in 2019. We utilize data that we collected ourselves as well as local partners and citizen volunteer. In that map above, you kind of can see where existing data that the PCA knows of exists. You also may know, living in the area, that we experienced a moderate to severe drought in the lower Rainy and the Rapid River watersheds in 2017 and 2018, which kind of slowed down the production of just our sampling in general. And some parameters were unfortunately not sampled because of it. Next slide. So after our assessments in 2019, we began to write our watershed monitoring and assessment reports. Those were published in June of 2020. The lower Rainy and the Rapid River were combined. The biologist that was working on it was writing both of those reports, as well as local partners' input kind of suggested that we could just combine that report into one report. Both of these reports are relatively large, but I wouldn't let that overwhelm you. You can easily cut it down to summaries and recommendations, which is a page for the entire watershed, or the individual sub-watersheds if you're looking for specific information for projects or the system that you live on. So next slide. So Rainy Lake is a fairly large watershed, but a small portion of it is within the United States. Roughly about 6% of it is within Minnesota boundaries, and the largest tributary to that system is the Rat Root River. We originally selected 6 biological monitoring stations throughout this watershed, and we ended up sampling only 5 of those. The only one that we did miss was the upstream site on the Rat Root River because of a large beaver impoundment that kind of hindered that from happening. There are 25 fish species that were captured within this watershed, and fish IBI scores were fairly well. Most of them are well above the impairment threshold. There was one just below it that was indicating a potential impairment, but it was within the lower confidence interval, and using best professional judgment and the macroinvertebrate data, we ended up assessing that as full support. So next slide. So in this watershed, we only sampled 2 stations for aquatic bugs. The reasons for this was not the drought. It was that the 2 upper stations did not fit the protocol for sampling macroinvertebrates, and the downstream station on the Rat Root River was not weightable. And currently, we do not have a tool to assess non-weightable streams for macroinvertebrates. We are in development using Hester Dendy's to be able to do that. We do look forward to assessing that portion of the Rat Root for aquatic life down the road as well. Next slide. So only 2 intensive water chemistry stations were within this watershed. One's a load monitoring site, and then we also used additional information from local partners, citizen volunteers, anything that was submitted to us to make an aquatic life use or aquatic rec use determination. There was high total suspended solids in the lower reaches of the Rat Root River and the East Branch Rat Root River. And there was also low dissolved oxygen at the Rat Root River station as well. Next slide. So 3 stream reaches were assessed for aquatic life. A policy decision was made to assess the East Branch of the Rat Root River as full support despite the TSS levels not meeting standards. This was due to both biological indicators, macroinvertebrates, and the fish meeting standards or well above standards and indicating full support. What better way to assess aquatic life than using aquatic life itself? And then there was no assessment on the lower portion of the Rat Root River. Both dissolved oxygen and TSS weren't meeting standards, but fish were indicating full support. Due to the reason that we didn't get any macroinvertebrate data there in 2017 or 18, we decided to not assess this reach until that data is collected. We did collect that data in 2019, but as I said before, we don't have a tool to assess it as of now. We hope to get to that point in a few years, hopefully before cycle 2. and we can assess that reach for aquatic life. Then only 2 stream reaches and Rainy Lake itself were assessed for aquatic recreation. Bacteria levels were pretty low throughout the watershed, and it indicated full support for those water bodies. Next slide. Moving on to the lower Rainy and the Rapid River watershed. All the fish IBI scores met standards or were near state standards and were assessed as full support. The lower Black River met exceptional use standards and is afforded the extra protection it gets from that standing. So, and there's also another one worth mentioning is the Winter Road River, which was near exceptional use and should be considered high value water. Majority of the fish IBI scores and the macroinvertebrate IBI scores within that drainage were meeting exceptional use or were very near it. The next slide. So as you can notice on this map, there's a lot less data points for macroinvertebrate sampling. It's due to the drought conditions and also our index period. So our index period for macroinvertebrates is later in the year, August, September, October. And because of that, naturally we'll have lower conditions there, but due to the drought, we had extremely low conditions and quite a few sites were not deemed sampleable because of that. So we were kind of limited on the amount of data we actually collected. Unfortunately, we had 2 back-to-back years of drought conditions, and that led to that. But all the IBI scores that were collected for macroinvertebrates were meeting state standards, and there's a few that were meeting exceptional use as well. Existing data on the lower Black River from 2005 helped us make the determination of exceptional use. Although that data is not used in this assessment, it also is used as a tool to help identify reaches that are exceptional use. The next slide. There were only 8 intensive water chemistry stations within these 2 watersheds. Additional information was used from local partners and citizen volunteers as in every watershed. There was definitely some high total suspended solids in the lower reaches of the larger tributaries, and a lot of this might be tied to the natural background of the area, the glacier lake sediments that have been left there, as well as maybe some anthropogenic stressors from ditching and altered hydrology within these watersheds. Next slide. So only 2 aquatic life impairments exist now within these watersheds. Where conventional water chemistry indicators contradicted biological monitoring results, a policy decision was made to not assess those or assess them as full support, depending if we had complete biological data. So if we had both fish and macroinvertebrates clearly meeting standards, but a TSS standard not meeting it, we did go full support. And because, like I said before, there's no better way to judge aquatic life than using aquatic life itself. So on the other side of it, you can see the lower Black River in your, what would it be? Your far right corner of the watershed. It's kind of blank where the exceptional use was before. That was not assessed because we only had the fish parameter there, and it wasn't meeting TSS standards. So we just kind of punted on that, waiting for additional data, and we'll make an assessment on that further down the road. There is an existing aquatic life impairment on the Bedette River due to low dissolved oxygen. That was listed in 1994. Early morning data collection, primary in 2009 and 10, indicated oxygen levels were meeting state standards during the summer months, and we also collected some during the winter that exceeded the impairment threshold, but not many of them. A lot of this kind of is complicated in the Bedette, lower Bedette, is because of the backwater flow from the Rainy River itself, low gradient nature, and the wetland nature of its watershed itself. This is existing impairment. It's the little red dot you kind of can see towards your upper left. And it's something that has been looked at. And then the other aquatic life impairment that you'll see on there is the rapid river as it pours right into the Rainy River. This is due to high sediment loads. We do not have any biological data on that reach to contradict that. So we had to move ahead with the status of impaired water there. So next slide. 2 aquatic recreation impairments exist in this watershed. Both are in the Black River drainage, the Black River main stem itself, and the West Fork Black River. There are elevated bacteria concentrations that led to this impairment, and they have been listed. Next slide. So I know that was kind of fast, quick. So if you have any questions, make sure you get to me about them. I can always be reached at my email address that's cut off there. So a total of 2 of the 26 stream reaches that we assessed were impaired for aquatic life, and 2 of the 9 were assessed were impaired for aquatic rec. The better look at this is actually stream miles that we looked at. So it's not heavily impacted for aquatic life use, but aquatic rec was those 2 longer reaches on the black were kind of the result of the higher percentage of stream miles assessed as impaired. But if you have any questions or concerns, let me know.
Yeah, I guess with that, there was one question in the chat, Nate. The question was, is the TSS levels naturally occurring on the east branch of the Rat Root River? And then it goes on to say it doesn't appear that there is much land disturbance activities in that portion. So the question was just kind of the TSS levels in that east branch of the Rat Root River. Could you speak more to that, or maybe somebody else on the panel could touch on that as well?
I'm not sure if Jenny Jasperson is here. She's been looking into that more than I have. She handles stressor identification on that. And I would assume due to the, fine sediments left by the glacier lake there, it's likely due to the natural background of the system itself. And that's why we kind of led into that policy of assessing those reaches with 2 biological parameters as full support if they were meeting, and just ignoring the TSS standard, because it kind of gets dirty in those glacier lake deposit areas.
Hi, Nate. This is Amy Mustonen, project manager for Rainy Lake at the MPCA, and just wanted to say that was really well put. Just want to add that they're in the Rainy Lake watershed and the work that we are doing. There will be an additional report that does a little bit, does get into a little bit more of the source assessment, stressor identification side of things. That'll be called a stressor identification report. And so that should be coming out this winter, and we'll have more information on that.
And I want to add, since Nate, I'm so sorry that your slides were formatted incorrectly. So what I'm going to do is, in addition to posting this video, I will also be putting this entire presentation in its entirety after I fix these as a PDF, along with a link right under the recording on the same website you registered on, so everyone can kind of see what's missing as well. Okay, anything else, Nate, that you have? Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Nate, very much. And I think we are ready in that case then. And I'm going to ask Pat to share your screen, please. Pat Conrad from Evans and Olivier will be presenting now. I will stop sharing. Pat, take it away.
Okay. Are you seeing?
Yes. It is not in full view.
It is on in full view. Wonderful. Okay. Great. Thank you for that introduction. I am Pat Conner. I'm working with the project team to put together this RAPS, and as Mike mentioned, these RAPS they contain 3 phases, and this graphic I've got here is analogous to his clock that he showed. So really, we're talking about these 3 phases of a RAPS project where, essentially we look at the conditions of the watershed, this monitoring and assessment that Nathan just summarized for us. Then we dig into this RAPS, this watershed restoration and protection strategies phase, which I'll get into. And then, like Mike mentioned, we get into the actual implementation activities, figure out what we can fix, do the actual work. Hopefully that results in improved water quality. So into this watershed restoration and protection strategies bit, I think it's important to look at these 2 pieces of it, right? We've got the restoration and the protection. So the restoration obviously is implying that we're going to be fixing some problems, and those would be the problems that Mike or I'm sorry, Nathan just outlined for us, right? Let me just see. Okay. All right. So, just kind of a big picture overall summary of the findings. We have a handful of impaired resources. We've got that rapid river, we've got sediment issue, we've got the 2 forks of the Black River that have bacteria issues. Baudette River with the dissolved oxygen, that's kind of a different story there, where we think it's kind of natural conditions, or maybe that system is somewhat healed itself. And then, as Nathan mentioned, we've got a couple of issues where we do have TSS problems, but they really haven't manifested themselves in any known aquatic disruptions. Okay, so digging a little deeper in here, for the Rapid River, we've got that lower portion where we've got the TSS, and it really is just this lowest portion of the Rapid River. So that's where we've got high turbidity and sediment. But really, we've got a number of exceedances here, and the percentage of exceedances is about 39.9%. So on to the lower Rainy River. This is where we've got the bacteria issues in the Black River. And let me see, I think I have a zoom in map of those as Nathan showed us as well. So these are areas where we've got the bacteria impairments. And then finally in the Rainy River-Rainy Lake, again, we've got some turbidity, TSS exceedances, but again, really manifested themselves into a known aquatic, a disruption to that aquatic community. So, here's in these watersheds where we know we have problems, so that next step is kind of determining, well, what's causing these problems, right? What can we do about them? Before we know what we can do about them, we kind of have to know what those sources of the problems are. As Amy mentioned, in the case of the Rat Root River, they'll be doing some additional work to determine, stressor identification in that system. The case of the Rapid River, when we have sediment problems, we typically think of, erosion from farm fields, right? I mean, cropland and high agricultural areas are known for a lot of sediment runoff. Construction areas, that kind of stuff. That's just not the case here, right? I mean, we don't have those types of land uses. So, what the modeling shows is, a lot of this is just coming from the bed and the bank. We have some wetland systems that may be generating some sediment at different times of the year, but you can see that, we don't have those typical cropland issues in this watershed. And it's important to understand because, like I mentioned, ultimately what we're going to want to do here is fix these problems, right? And so we kind of need to know what are we looking at in terms of land uses and problem areas that we want to address. So, this is just an example for the sediment sources. When we look at those bacteria Again, typically, agricultural runoff is one of the leading causes of having bacteria populations in a stream. You know, and you can imagine feedlots that might be leaky. You can imagine places where we're applying manure to the land, right? And you don't. And again, with this watershed, we don't have those types of land uses. So it's really more of an investigation into what are these potential sources to the bacteria, so that we know what to do and how to fix that moving forward. So, you know, that's kind of the process that we're going through with this RAPS is determining where do we have these problem areas and what can we do about them. We typically talk in terms of prioritization and targeting, right? And so I'm going to kind of lead you through some of the work that the group of professionals, local and state professionals, have been working through on these watersheds, where we're looking at, you know, where do we have these specific problem areas or high value resources, and then where can we focus our efforts. So, you know, there's a wealth of information that's been collected statewide on all of our watersheds that's available to the local professionals to kind of assess this information and evaluate the watersheds and really kind of hone in on where it is that we should focus our energies, right? So in the case of the, show you, in the case of, you know, a prioritization, we've got a bunch of different data sets that we can use to kind of, you know, really pigeon in and show what is the data showing us, where are our priority areas. And I'm just showing in the case of the Rapid River, you know, we've looked at a bunch of these data sets. We've kind of prioritized them amongst the working group here, but you can see the types of data sets that we've been reviewing and looking at in terms of prioritization. And these are data sets that we'll have available for you next week. We can look into these a little bit more detail and talk about them, what this stuff means. But you can just kind of see here's where we're really looking at where are there hot spots or where are there indicators of problems in these watersheds. And then from the flip side of that, from the okay, here's the problem areas, but then from the flip side of being, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of targeting implementation activities and action? Then we kind of look at a different set of tools, right? And there's some overlap. There's some things that, you know, help us prioritize and to target. And so here I'm showing just kind of those, an example of those data sets that we've been reviewing and looking at for the Rainy River and Rainy Lake watershed. So here you can see we're looking at more of like, where are there opportunities and where could we be doing work to fix our problems? So essentially what that comes up with then is, you know, we have a priority list of sub-watersheds and we have the types of resource improvements or restoration strategies, if you will, that we think are important in those given areas. So in the case of the Rapid River, we've kind of prioritized hydrologic restoration in these upper watersheds, you know, the southern watershed, if you will, that's where we have, you know, some historic ditching and draining. You know, we're looking at stream bank stability types of strategies within that corridor, and then ecological and phosphorus loading issues down in the lower portions of this watershed. We have a similar set of maps for the other two watersheds that I won't get into today, but that's some of the stuff that we'll be looking at next week and hopefully getting more input from locals on that information. So, you know, that's kind of what we're doing from the restoration side of things. You know, where should we focus our energies on fixing the problems that we have in these watersheds? I think, you know, Nathan did a nice job of summarizing the issues in the watersheds, and it's remarkably few problems in these watersheds, right? I mean, if if you went anywhere further south in the state, you know, his presentation would have been 2 hours long because he would have been having to talk about all the stream impairments from a sediment standpoint, impaired lakes from a phosphorus standpoint, you know, bacteria from farmlands, all that kind of stuff. It would have been a long presentation. So, you know, I think that kind of the point here is that these watersheds are really in pretty good condition. So there's not a lot of restoration that is needed. So moving on to kind of this protection end of things, right? And so we have this kind of this graphic where we look at, you know, what is the percent of the watershed that is protected, you know, in kind of you know, state lands, or maybe it's in wetlands, it's in kind of protected status, if you will, against kind of this watershed disturbance. And if you look at that, you know, that kind of gives you this idea of what we should be doing in terms of protection versus restoration. And I think we'll see is that, you know, in the case of these watersheds, we're way over on the lower end of these things, right? We're way over in that kind of that vigilance or that protection standpoint. Kind of see that in this very simple graphic of these three watersheds. And these are the, you know, kind of the protected lands, protected lands in these watersheds. So you can see, you know, a lot of these watersheds are already in kind of a protected state. In the case of the Rapid River watershed, you know, land cover really is kind of tells the story, doesn't it? I mean, we have 90% of the land in this watershed that is in wetland. That is a wetland condition right now. Similarly, in the lower Rainy River, we've got about 92% of the land being wetland. And finally, in the case of the Rainy River-Rainy Lake, you know, here's one where, you know, 70% of that land within this watershed is owned by the state of Minnesota or federal government. And you can kind of see the breakdown of those land uses. But, you know, 98% of this watershed is undeveloped or utilized for timber production, hunting, fishing, canoeing, hiking, or other recreational opportunities. So you can really, you know, you really see why these watersheds are in the condition that they're in because of that land cover and the protection status that's afforded to to the lands in these watersheds. So, you know, that's kind of a summary of this watershed, the restoration and protection strategies development that we're working on. You know, the next steps, and hopefully many of you can come back and join us next week. The next step is really to kind of look at that local expertise, you know, get kind of a flavor from locals in terms of, you know, what are the priority resources to you? Which resources do you feel, you know, are a higher priority than other? Which ones are used more often? You know, just get that kind of that local flair. You know, typically this process would be us sitting around a table and with a series of maps and markers and, you know, just having these kind of conversations. And obviously that COVID doesn't allow us to do that. So we're going to have to get a little creative next week in how we facilitate these discussions. But we really do just want to learn from locals, the people that have been on these waters and the people that use them, have friends that use them. We want to understand, you know, what you've seen, what you think what your priorities are, what you've seen in terms of problem areas in the watershed. You know, where do you think that there are resources that are, you know, underrated or we didn't even see in our assessment report? We want to get all that kind of information from you. So that's what I had for today. I'm hoping many of you come back and engage in a further conversation next week. And I will see if I can figure out how to unshare.
Well, Pat, while we're switching, I want to say thank you so much for that great presentation. It is sparking a few questions, which is great. We will have some time for that too. And before I get into that, I just want to make sure that I go through just a couple things, building on what you just said. And thank you for the great plug for next week. There is going to be a presentation Next week, same time, same place, different registration. So on the same website that you registered for this, there is another link you'll see below. Actually, there's two other links, and I'll explain that for October 27th for this one. And that is the public input session that Pat was just discussing. And so that is going to be a great place for us to really dig deeper into what's valuable to you all in the resource area in the 3 watersheds. So we really would love to have you tell your friends, bring them in. That one we aren't really planning to record, just so that people can feel more comfortable discussing it freely. And so that one we will allow mics on, more so it's not going to be this presentation where you're watching so much. It's more of an input session. We really want to hear from you. So that one is an hour from 12 until 1 again next week, next Tuesday. There is also a link in between the 2 dates. You're going to see a middle link, and that has a survey that is live today. And that survey is a way for you to also give your input to talk about each watershed or just one watershed. But it'll lead you through the process of just going into the watersheds that you choose to discuss. And it's a SurveyMonkey link. There's also a map link to the more detailed maps of the watersheds for you to peruse as you're answering, which are in the survey, but just in case it's not as easy to see there, we did also blow them up. Thank you, Mike Hurst, for doing that, and threw that on the website as well. This presentation in its entirety will be online as a PDF as well, but also recorded. So this recording is going to be live either later today or early tomorrow. It depends on how long that takes to process. I will leave my thank yous for after. I suppose most of what I just said is there, but maybe I'll do it. Thank you for the MPCA, for Emmons and Olivier, and Mike for working with Couchiching FWCD on this at Lake of the Woods FWCD. So at this time, we do have quite a bit of time. We have 14 minutes. So I'd like to open it up to questions. And Mike Hurst, I know you've been watching that, and there has been a little discussion, but I haven't been watching to see what else is there. So Mike Hurst, I'm going to turn that over to you and see what you've got.
Yeah, I guess there was a